There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when someone speaks their truth for the very last time. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of weight, the kind that settles in the chest and stays. In the spring of 1989, that silence fell across a television studio in Hollywood, and the woman who caused it was not a grieving widow or a dying poet. She was Lucille Ball, the woman who had once made an entire nation laugh so hard they forgot their troubles. But that afternoon, she was not laughing. She was letting the world see her, finally, as she truly was. And what they saw left no one unmoved. To understand what that final interview meant, you have to understand what Lucille Ball had built, and what she had lost along the way. Long before she became the most recognizable face on American television, Lucille Desiree Ball was a little girl in Jamestown, New York, learning how to survive. Her father, Henry Ball, died when she was just 3 years old, taken by typhoid fever before he ever had the chance to watch his daughter become extraordinary. That early grief never left her. She carried it quietly, the way people carry things they have no words for, folded up small and tucked somewhere behind the eyes. Her childhood was marked by instability. Her mother, young and overwhelmed after her husband's death, had to send Lucille to live with relatives while she tried to piece their lives back together. When her mother eventually remarried, the household Lucille entered was cold and rigid. There were rules that stripped joy from ordinary things. She learned early how to wear a composed face over a bruised heart. She would later say that those years didn't break her, they trained her. They taught her the discipline of performance, how to hold yourself together in front of others even when you are quietly coming undone. Then, when she was 12, another catastrophe arrived. An accident involving a neighbor boy, a target practice session gone terribly wrong, left a young child paralyzed and her family financially destroyed. They lost their home. Her grandfather, tormented by guilt, never recovered. Lucille absorbed that lesson too, that a single moment, just one careless second, could erase everything a family had built. She swore to herself she would never be that vulnerable again. She would build something no one could take from her. What she built was a career. She arrived in New York as a teenager with nothing but ambition and the refusal to accept failure. Her early attempts at dramatic training were humiliating. Instructors told her she had no talent, that she was wasting her time. Most people would have taken those words to heart and quietly found another dream. Lucille Ball took them as a challenge. She returned, again and again, modeling to pay her bills and studying the craft she loved with a relentless, almost ferocious dedication. Hollywood eventually noticed her. Through the 1930s, she appeared in dozens of films, rarely in starring roles, usually as the girl in the background, the comic sidekick, the woman who lit up every scene she was in but was never handed the spotlight. She studied every director she worked under, every leading lady she supported. She was learning. She was always learning. In 1940, while filming a musical comedy called Too Many Girls, she met a young Cuban musician and actor named Desi Arnaz. Their chemistry was immediate, loud, and inconvenient to everyone around them. Within months, they were married. Everyone said it wouldn't last. He was impulsive and charming and prone to late nights that turned into stories she didn't want to hear. She was disciplined, driven, and deeply loyal to people who did not always deserve it. They were, in many ways, the worst possible match for each other. And they were, in ways that mattered enormously, the best creative partnership American television would ever see. When CBS approached Lucille in 1951 about turning her radio program into a television series, she had one condition: Desi would play her husband on screen. The network resisted, skeptical that audiences would accept an interracial couple in their living rooms. Lucille refused to move. She and Desi took their act on the road, performing live for audiences across the country, proving beyond any doubt that people didn't just accept them, they adored them. CBS relented. I Love Lucy premiered in October 1951, and within a year, it had become the most watched show in America. At its peak, more than 44 million people tuned in every week to watch Lucy Ricardo chase one impossible scheme after another, always finding herself in spectacular, glorious trouble. Lucille's comic genius was rooted in something rare. She was willing to be completely ridiculous. She sacrificed dignity, vanity, and physical grace for the sake of a laugh, and audiences worshipped her for it. She was not playing the beautiful woman above it all. She was playing every woman who had ever wanted something badly and made a mess trying to get it. Behind the cameras, though, the marriage was slowly fracturing under the weight of Desi's drinking, his infidelities, and the exhausting pressure of running a television empire together. Their fights were fierce and frequent. She stayed longer than she should have, held on tighter than was good for her, and finally filed for divorce in 1960, one day after they filmed their final episode together. 20 years of love and chaos, of laughter and heartbreak, ended on a piece of legal paper. She kept the studio. She bought Desi out for $2.5 million and became the first woman to run a major Hollywood production company. She was powerful, respected, and utterly alone in a way she had never allowed herself to admit. She remarried in 1961 to a comedian named Gary Morton. He was kind, patient, and devoted, everything Desi had often not been. But the great love of her life had moved on, and some part of Lucille Ball moved on with him, leaving behind a version of herself she could never quite recover. The years that followed brought more loss than she let on publicly. Her children grew up and away. Friends she had known for decades began to disappear, some to illness, some to the natural drift of lives lived differently. Vivian Vance, her closest friend and on-screen partner, died of cancer in 1979, and Lucy described the grief as losing a piece of herself she would never get back. In 1986, she made one final attempt to recapture what television had meant to her. Life with Lucy debuted to great fanfare, the legendary redhead returning to the medium she had conquered. The show was canceled after 8 episodes. Critics were unkind. Audiences had changed, and the style of comedy that Lucy had invented 4 decades earlier felt out of place in the world that comedy had built from her foundation. She read every review. She took each one personally. She did not speak of it much, but people close to her said something went quiet in her after that cancellation. A light that had burned for 60 years flickered noticeably lower. And then Desi died. In the final weeks of 1986, Desi Arnaz was fading. Lung cancer had taken hold. Lucille flew to see him, sat beside him, held conversations full of old jokes and older sorrows. On November 30th, their wedding anniversary, she called him, and their daughter held the phone to his ear. Lucille, who had spent 50 years turning pain into laughter, could only find 3 words. "I love you," she said, again and again. And Desi, barely strong enough to speak, whispered them back. 2 days later, he was gone. 5 days after his death, still raw with grief she had not yet had time to process, Lucille attended the Kennedy Center Honors in Washington. She had not planned to go. Her family convinced her. Midway through the ceremony, actor Robert Stack walked to the stage holding a letter. Desi had written it in his final days, knowing she would be honored that week, wanting to be there in the only way still available to him. Stack read it aloud to the room. Desi had been asked, the letter explained, to divide the credit for "I Love Lucy" among its many contributors. His answer was simple and absolute. Give Lucy 90%, he had said, and divide the remaining 10 among everyone else. Lucy was the show. The rest of them, Vivian, William Frawley, even Desi himself, were, in his words, props. Damn good props. But props. And then, in the letter's final line, he wrote what he had always known. "I Love Lucy" was never just a title. The camera found Lucille Ball in the audience. Her hands were trembling. Her eyes had filled. Gary Morton held her hand and did not let go. And then, for the first time in public memory, Lucille Ball, the woman who could make a room laugh through any heartbreak, wept. She did not dab her eyes politely. She cried the way people cry when something they have held for a very long time is finally released. The entire room cried with her. President Reagan and the First Lady sat nearby, and they were not unmoved either. It was the most honest moment of her career, and it was a goodbye she never expected to receive. A few months later, Lucille Ball sat for what would become her last televised interview. She was thinner than audiences remembered. Her voice had softened, but her wit arrived before anything else. She was still sharp, still capable of a perfectly timed line that made the room exhale in laughter. Those around her on set said being in her presence still felt like standing near something warm. The interviewer asked the question that always gets asked of legends near the end. What did she want to be remembered for? Lucille was quiet for a long moment. The silence stretched in that particular way, not uncomfortable, but full, the way a room feels after a piece of music ends. Then she said, simply and without performance, for making people happy. The room was still. She smiled, the faint, private smile of someone who has arrived, after a very long journey, at the only truth that ever mattered, and added, "That's all I ever wanted." Those 6 words carried 60 years inside them. They carried a little girl in Jamestown, learning how to pretend everything was fine. They carried a young woman who was told she had no talent and refused to believe it. They carried the dizzy peak of 44 million viewers and the quiet devastation of 8 canceled episodes. They carried the love of her life, twice lost and never forgotten. They carried every laugh she had ever engineered for strangers who never knew what it cost her. That's all I ever wanted. On April 26, 1989, weeks after that interview, days after a surgery she seemed briefly to survive, Lucille Ball's heart gave out. She was 77 years old. We remember her as the redhead, as the woman with the rubber face and the elastic timing, the actress who could make a simple pratfall into high art, who turned the domestic frustrations of mid-century American womanhood into something simultaneously absurd and deeply recognizable. We remember the chocolate factory, and the grape stomping, and the Vitamita Vegamin. But the woman behind all of that was something else entirely. She was someone who had learned grief before she learned language, who had been told she was nothing and decided to become everything, who loved too deeply and too long for her own peace of mind, who kept showing up even when showing up was the hardest thing available to her. The final interview was not the interview of a woman defeated by time. It was the interview of a woman who had finally, after all the cameras and the laughter and the noise, found the quiet at the center of herself and decided to let people see it. She wanted to make people happy. For 60 years, she did exactly that. And on the afternoon of her last interview, sitting in that room with her fading voice and her permanent wit and her 6 honest words, she made an entire world feel the exact kind of sadness that only comes from having loved something very much. That is its own kind of happiness. That is, perhaps, the deepest kind. And she knew it.